Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Dr. Brad Vaughn, formerly called Jackson Wu. He does explain why he went by that pen name for a couple of decades. We get into that towards the middle end of the podcast. Brad has a PhD in applied theology from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, earned his MDiv from Gordon Conwell Seminary, and MA in philosophy from Texas A&M. He's the author of a few books, Saving God's Face, Reading Romans with Eastern Eyes, Seeking God's Face, and the Cross in Context. And Brad has become kind of an expert in understanding honor-shame cultures and how that influences our reading of the Bible, how it affects our ecclesiology, and so on and so forth. So that becomes the bulk of our conversation. We do get into some controversies that he found himself pulled into recently. So I don't know if I need to give a warning for that, whatever, but just know that that's kind of where we end up going toward the end of the podcast. So really enjoyed getting to know Brad. So please welcome to the show, the one and only Dr. Brad Vaughn. Brad, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's funny because we recently got in touch, but a mutual, really good friend of ours, Spencer McCush, has told me for years that I need to have you on the podcast. So this is, long overdue. I'm super glad we got reconnected.
Yeah, ditto. Absolutely. I've been told that you and I are kindred spirits. And so I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah,
Spencer knows both of us.
we could both be idiots. We'll see. So you were ministering. Do you like the term missionary? I just had a conversation with another guy who says, I think we need to ditch the term missionary, but you were.
It's fine. I'm because I'm less American than I used to be. I'm not into some of the word policing that I'm seeing in American culture. So yeah, I'm a cross-cultural worker, missionary, whatever. Okay, cross-cultural worker. I like that a lot better. So you were a cross-cultural worker in China for how long? A couple decades, or? It's 2003 to 2019.
What led you to that kind of ministry?
Honestly, it was one day I felt the Lord saying, "Go to China," and I turned to my wife. I go, as weird as it sounds, I think we're supposed to go to China. And she goes, Wow. All right, let's do it.
Just like that.
It was, wow. It was right after I'd finished my master's in philosophy. And I decided then, I don't want to be a PhD in philosophy. And I was looking at some different things. And that was back when the church planting movement was like really big and like, emergent and stuff. So I was thinking that, but then God just said, no, you're going to go be in obscurity in China. So that's what we did.
Did you do a lot of kind of cross-cultural research before you got there? Or, because we're going to end up talking a lot about just cross-cultural ministry, honor-shame cultures versus American power. Is it power, fear, whatever the, Did you know a lot of that going in, or did you learn on the ground kind of what cross-cultural ministry looked like?
On the ground, but you'd be surprised actually at how much my background prepared me in a very weird way. I grew up in East Texas, a poor family. Okay. A lot of my family members call themselves white trash, or trailer trash. So like that's very honor shame oriented there. Huh. And so when I went to China, I'm seeing these honor shame dynamics, and I'm going, wait a minute, it's different, but there's some similarities here. And so I just got really curious and started digging into everything I could. Cultural adjustment's always hard. Yeah. But also at the time, that was when John Piper was kind of at his like. Everybody was listening to John Piper, and he was talking about the glory of God. And I thought, wait a minute, they're talking about face and honor and my background and glory of God. Okay, I really got to dive into this and figure out how all this works together with the Bible and Chinese culture.
Interesting. What kind of ministry were you involved in? Like when you went over, like church planting?
Initially, it was teaching English and evangelism. Okay. But then I moved pretty quickly into church planting, helping with that. And then most of the time was spent. I was part of a founding team that started a underground seminary, an accredited seminary for the underground house church. That's what I spent the most of our time doing.
Okay. For people that maybe don't know anything about the church in China or Christianity in China, give us a kind of a 101 overview of you go over there and what is Christianity like?
Sure. Over there? Everything you've heard is true somewhere, Yeah. So it really is. And so in the China's kind of looks like a chicken if you look at a map, and kind of at the belly of the chicken is where most believers are on the East Coast. That's where a lot of population is. Very organized. They don't work in terms of denominations. They work in relational networks. Very large church, but increasingly they're facing more and more opposition and persecution because of the government. And so, yes, there's an openness more in the South, but the more closer to Beijing you get, and of course, religious persecution is very, very severe the more west you go. So it's a little of everything.
Okay. So, you know, we all hear, I mean, I don't want to assume too much knowledge from my audience, but most people have heard, you know, there's just this massive growth in Christianity, largely through underground house churches. There is a state recognized church that tends to be maybe a little more nominal, but the real vibrancy is happening with the underground persecuted house church. That's at least kind of the narrative I hear. Is that largely correct? Does it depend on the region? And
will want to argue with me, but in general, I'm going to find more vibrancy, more zeal and evangelism and concern for scripture and so forth and so on in the house church. But the truth is, there in a lot of places, there's a lot more overlap. And I've done a lot of my training in the back rooms of 3 self churches, the public churches.
Okay.
You know, because they had protection. You know, so a lot of the kind of reforms, the socialist Christianity that's being put out, that's all through the public church. So there's health and dishealth everywhere, but in the whole, that's a fairish characterization.
Okay. And what percentage would you say are Christians in China? Do we have data on
that? It's all estimation. I mean, you're dealing with estimations from 60,000 or
600.
I'm getting my 600,000. No, I won't go to numbers, but I would say you're dealing with something like 7%. It depends on the number. You know, because some people look at 150 million. You're somewhere dealing with 60 million. That's what I was looking for, is the word million, not thousand. Yeah. So, you know, it depends on the range and what you count. So I would say somewhere around 100 million is about the middle of where everybody guesses.
So I heard in the little research I did, so like in 1948, is it when Christianity became illegal, or was there some kind of shift right after World War II?
Yeah, 49 is when there was the big push for the missionaries to get out. Yeah.
Okay, and there was maybe how many, like a few 100,000 Christians at that time or something, and it's grown to at least 100 million in 60 plus years. Right. That's insane.
So,
I mean,
I mean, from very little to what I don't know, actually more or less like 5%. I have to do my math right now, but especially if you count house church and the hidden network that can't be counted, the public church. So it's really blown up, and it came about in all the persecution, especially in the 60s and 70s.
It can't. So the persecution, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, kind of thing. Like the more is persecuted, the more it grew.
A lot of outsiders thought, well, there's probably not going to be much left of the church. And then around 1980, when the church, China opened up again, all of a sudden they saw this massive group of Christians, and they're like blown away. And so when you see this tightening and restriction now in the Chinese church, a lot of us are less worried in the sense of like, will the church survive sort of thing, because they thrive in tough situations. They are very connected. They're very communal oriented. They know how to evangelize. And I know some believers think this is a good thing, the more recent kind of wave of persecution resistance, because they see it as a purging, because being a Christian got a little too comfortable.
Oh, really?
It just became more like, oh, you could do it. And so anybody could be a Christian, because it wasn't looked down upon as much by the government. But now the government's jumping in, people will go, never mind.
So there's a recent kind of growing persecution of the church in China?
Yeah, the current president, Xi Jinping, basically has no term limits. He kind of has given the same power as Mao Zedong had back in the 60s and 70s, and clamping down on anything that's deemed as foreign. And basically all religion is deemed foreign because of Marxist, socialism, which ironically is foreign. But
so China, would you say it's more agnostic, atheistic as a whole, as a culture, not necessarily because it has Buddhist roots, or what's the
it's extremely nominal cultural Buddhism, burning money to ancestors. It's just different ways of honoring the family. Form of religion, just not a really big deal. It's more like folk religion at best, honoring ancestors.
Buddhism isn't technically a religion anyway, right?
It depends on which researcher you talk to, I guess.
Okay. It has religious life, but there's not like a single deity or deities that it worship?
Of course, that's going to depend on what kind of thread
Okay.
of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, so forth and so on.
Okay.
But for us in our work, we didn't have to deal with, it was actually a lot easier to do ministry in China than in India, because in India, you have to deconstruct a whole lot and then build back up.
Okay.
But in China, there's like no religion, no anything, for a whole lot of people, and you're starting from kind of nothing.
Okay. Interesting.
That's actually kind of convenient.
Yeah. I've been to Kathmandu a few times, where I think Buddha's from there, right? Isn't he the Buddha? They have the whole I forget what it's called, the main kind of temple or whatever. Where yeah.
So that's it's a diverse country, and so I'm sure people who are from China are going to object to something I say. But as I said, something is true everywhere.
Right.
And I spent most of my time working with the house church.
Okay, so let's talk to us about the different cultural dynamics. Specifically, like I would love to do a deep dive into how an honor shame culture operates, how that kind of reconfigures maybe how they approach Christianity, and how that compares with the U.S. context in particular. Or maybe, I guess you can say a Western country.
Well, you'll have to cut me off, because this is a big question, right?
Yeah.
So first off, when we talk about honor shame cultures, it's kind of a misnomer, because the truth is all cultures are honor shame cultures, so to speak. All care about honor, all care about shame. The only difference is that these traditional cultures are far more aware of it, more explicitly aware of it, whereas in the States and a lot of Western countries, it's kind of more hidden. And we hide it under different ways. But honor, just to put it simply, honor is a person's right to respect. So it's qualities that are deemed praiseworthy. In Chinese, they talk about face. It talks about your status, your position, right? And that could be because of something you did or somebody right? And then shame, especially from a Chinese perspective, is this sense of propriety, or you're being sensitive to the opinions of others. And we get this. This is not just a Chinese thing, because if I said to you, "Hey, Preston, you're shameless," I don't think you'd probably take that as a compliment, right?
Yeah.
And the Chinese are just simply far more aware of that, whereas I think in the West, we've hidden it in all sorts of different ways. And so a lot of my dissertation work and all the books I've written are constantly exploring how does this stuff, these dynamics, since these are human dynamics, how do they play out in Scripture? And since they're human dynamics, how do they play out in other contexts? So there's as big of a view as possible. I'll let you follow up if you want to.
Yeah. Well, did you maybe give us an example of a social situation that kind of illustrates really strong kind of in your face honor shame dynamics?
Sure. Let's just think about in the West. I mean, first off, honor and shame can be achieved or what we call ascribed. Okay, so based on what you do, you're a really good runner, or you get all A's, you get honor, right? If you commit some kind of crime or say something negative, you be shamed, right? And if you the same thing with position. If my last name were Trump, Obama, Bush, or something like that, I would get a certain amount of honor or shame just because I walk into a room, depending on your kind of political persuasion, right? The CEO of an organization will get a certain amount of respect regardless of their moral failings, because they're in a certain position. Regardless of who's a president, I'm going to walk in, I'm going to respect the office, right? I think a lot of confusion, though, around this whole conversation of honor and shame is because a lot of scholars are looking past each other. So you have like Brene Brown talking about psychological shame, which is more like low self-esteem, right? But then you also have like social shame, which is like what anthropologists talk about. That's like when you're publicly shaming somebody or you're bullying somebody. Okay, Jesus dying on the cross, he was shamed on the cross. Okay, and so people tend to, and there's moral shame, this idea like this sensitivity to what's proper and what's right. Okay, so these are all interconnected, but they also have a certain amount of independence. So I could do something that gets the scorn and shame of my community, but then not feel, shameful myself. So that's one of the reasons I think people sometimes have a lot of half truths when they think about shame is, oh, it's just bad, or it's just psychological. And the truth is that shame and guilt are both objective and subjective. It's not like one is like real and the Bible stuff, and this other stuff is just mere cultural stuff. Because you could feel guilt or you could be guilty, right?
Right.
Subjective and objective. I could feel ashamed and I could be shamed, like by others, objective. So, and all of these are in scripture. So one of my big goals of the past few years has been to help people see that it's not a matter of guilt is the Bible and shame is culture, is that shame is actually a broader concept than guilt, and it's all throughout the Bible.
Interesting. Oh, you see the language of shame all over the place. Do you like the distinction that, most people have heard, that guilt is the feeling you get when you did something wrong, whereas shame is the feeling you get for who you are, so that it's not you did something wrong, it's you've been made to feel like you are a bad person. I don't even know if that
yeah, you're talking about like guilt about what you do and shame is about who you are.
Yeah, is that too? Yeah, what do you think?
I mean, it's certainly a simplification. There's a lot more that could be said, but I don't mind it in the sense that shame deals with not only what you do, because I could do something shameful, right? But it also is who I'm associated with, right? I mean, you think about, we don't want to be associated with those people, right?
All right.
Right. Because shame by association, not really guilt by association, right? But guilt is more about, the things you do and about transgressing boundaries. And guilt doesn't move you to do things positively, but a sense of shame does, because I want to be a certain type of person. And so it moves me forward to do right. And so I actually find it helpful because shame is more about identity. And that's about as Christian of an issue as you get.
When you first started kind of maybe seeing the different cultural dynamics, I'm sure it was early on in your time in China, how did that kind of reconfigure your approach to ministry? Like, did it have a radical effect on just your ecclesiology and evangelism and all this stuff? And what did that shift look like? Yeah.
I've made a writing career out of just teasing out the implications. And my whole dissertation was on the doctrine of salvation in terms of honor and shame. It started off because as we were trying to share the gospel with people, the word for sin in China is crime. And so you say, hey, you're a sinner. You say you're a criminal. And they'd be like, what are you talking about? I mean, just no idea. Because remember, they don't have a Christianized idea of sin. You're literally telling them you're a criminal. And they're like, okay, whatever, guys, peace out, right? And so I realized that, okay, if we can't get sin right, well, there's a whole lot of other stuff that we can't get right, right? And so I just started using kind of this word picture of sin is like publicly spitting in your father's face. And you see them, wow. Oh, okay, that makes sense. And we didn't spend like 5 conversations trying to get through what sin was. They go, oh, that makes sense. And then we could keep going, right? It's far more relational. They understand this whole idea of face, right? Which is one reason why my first book was titled Saving God's Face, because getting this dynamics of God's honor, right? And so that's what got me into it. And then again, listening to a lot of John Piper, I realized that if he's right and that glory is such a big deal in the Bible, it should permeate so much more of our scripture than our theology than it actually practically does for most people. And so that's where I dived into, all sorts of issues of salvation. And it led me to talk about, understand faith and basically any concept you have, there's some kind of honor shame dynamic involved. So
how would you, when you talk about salvation, like how would you describe what salvation is in a more honor shame context?
Yeah, well, and I will say this, it's important to say in an honor shame context, because I don't think that we can pick and choose, because honor and shame is in the Bible, just like guilt is, and just like uncleanness and all these other metaphors. So it's not an either or. But I think first off, you start off with this idea of understanding sin. And so sin, Paul defines in Romans, by the way, as dishonoring God. We can delve into that as you want, rather than this breaking of just a crime abstractly. And so we become shameful. Romans 1 comes to mind, right? Salvation is the removing of that shame and the receiving of glory, right? One of my favorite passages that, funny enough, no one talks about, even though it's more explicit than righteousness imputation that people talk about, but is in John 17:22, where Jesus prays to the Father saying, the glory that you have given me, I have given to them.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Well, yeah, isn't that worth the discussion? But I mean, just think about that. No one talks about that. And that's explicit. If I came in this podcast and say, hey, Preston, by the way, I got Jesus' glory, you'd be like, okay, we're stopping this right now.
So what does it mean? Yeah, unpack. Like, how would you explain that?
Well, I mean, at a broad stroke, I think it does have to do with the fact that we are able to use Paul's language. We're conformed to his likeness, and we're able to manifest his worth in our life. So we have the glory of the Father by virtue of association and union with him. I mean, that's a broad overview, but I think that's getting at the same basic idea that you're getting at in Romans 8:28-30, with this conformed to the image of Christ, leading to glorification.
So all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, meaning we don't live up to.
We lack the glory of God, and then the glory of God in Romans is a little bit nuanced, as you've studied Romans a lot, but this idea of this ultimate manifestation of who God is and his character and how we're designed to be. All right. So having the identity that we are supposed to be in, that vocation that we're supposed to be, and we lack that. We've basically muddied ourselves up so that we can't image that. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we lack. And how have we done that? Romans 2:23 is so explicit, where Paul directly defines sin as dishonoring God. And he cites Isaiah 4, as is written, the name of God is blasphemed among Gentiles because of you, making it very clear the big problem here is not merely that you've broken an abstract law, it's that you've dishonored God. And you see that, and that's how unrighteousness is described in chapter 1. People are oftentimes shocked when they read Romans 1-3 that Paul consistently is defining sin in terms of honor, shame, glory, not merely law code breaking.
Yeah. So you've dishonored the Father by misrepresenting who he is in how we're acting. Would that be?
I mean, and as a kernel, basically not reflecting who he is, not showing his worth, right? Yeah. And that comes out in all sorts of ways. So whose pleasure do you seek? Who do you want to receive praise or give face? So like Jesus actually, we're talking about Romans a lot in faith. Well, Jesus actually defines faith in terms of face, okay, or glory. So John 5:44, he says, how can you believe when you receive glory for one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? He's saying you can't believe if you're not seeking the glory that comes from God. And Romans 2, Paul actually says the righteous will seek after glory and honor. I mean, these are things that are in very popular books. We're not talking about Habakkuk and Third Hezekiah or these other books that people haven't heard of, right? Like John and Romans, it's overtly seek glory and honor. The issue is what kind of honor are you seeking? What kind of glory are you seeking? And then that's why Jesus says in John 12, if anyone seeks me, the Father will honor him. I mean, that's an enticement.
Yeah. And do you find that like honor shame cultures just have a better handle on the Bible when because these categories, I remember being exposed to kind of honor shame ways of thinking, and again, we all think that way on some level, but cultures that are very dominant, and going back and just seeing how pervasive the language is in the Bible, I'm like, I just glossed right over this. I mean, I despising the shame, Hebrews 12 and even the cross, we think of, man, that's such a painful way to die, which obviously it is, but the language most often used is not pain. In fact, is there ever pain language used? I mean, it's mainly shame, and that's the design. I mean, the Romans really developed crucifixion as a way of shaming the person, his family, anybody who was associated with them, which when the disciples scatter, it's like, yeah, they didn't want to be connected with this publicly shamed person, because then they received that,
Yeah. So there's a few points in what you said. First, your first question was, do honor shame cultures get the Bible better? And I'd say no, but they had the tools to get more of the Bible than we get. Okay. And what I mean by this is that I have found again and again that people from so-called honor shame cultures, their honor shame perspective actually prevents them from developing an honor shame theology. I know that sounds backwards, but honor shame cultures really value tradition, right? There's hierarchy, there's an appreciation for history. Okay. And so what does that mean? Well, a lot of the theology has been developed in the West. And so you'll have hey, this is what we've always believed. And then they will, at first, I found, say, I'm not sure. I haven't heard this in my reading of Sproul or whoever, Calvin, that they'll read, I've been in many of these conversations where they'll say that. But then I'll start pointing verses out like I've been talking to you. And then every time you see this, go, this is so Chinese. This, like, where'd you find this? I'm like, it's just there in the Bible, right? Because it's not just where the words honor and shame are, but think about language like the poor, the deaf. Gentiles was a shameful term. You're an outsider, right? You're not one of us. Barren, right? Those are all shame-laden words. To be welcomed, to be adopted, reconciled, blessed, clothed. Those are honorific terms, right? So it's in far more than just where you see a word pop up.
Okay, interesting. Oh shoot, I forgot my question. Shoot. Hold on a second. Let me.
I will say.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I will say this. When I was trying to show people that this concept was a very thoroughly biblical concept, they would want to argue Romans and the law and so forth and so on. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to write about how honor and shame influences the Bible, and I'm going to take on Romans.
Okay.
Because if I can show you that honor and shame are pervasive and important in Romans, well, then I win the whole argument. Because that's the most so-called legal book in the New Testament. Because they'll give me Habakkuk or Jonah or some other minor prophet that they never read. And sure enough, it's there perpetually. And I think misreadings actually perpetuate shame. Like misreadings of Romans 7 actually, perpetuate shame. And people, I kept finding that people didn't notice things like in Romans 9:33 and 10:11 or 10:12, Paul repeats the exact same verse about those who believe will not be put to shame.
Right.
He's talking about justification. It's justification in terms of not being put to shame. I'm like, why are we not talking about this more pervasively? Because this is going to help us contextualize also for the whole world, right? And so talking to Chinese, when they saw these, they got so excited because they actually had something that made sense to friends and family, because they said, this is super Chinese.
Yeah. Oh, here's my question. So you kind of said in passing, I just want to make sure I heard you right, that that the Chinese you're working with didn't naturally have these categories. Is it because they had just been we've had so much exported kind of American theology, and that's where they got their kind of like Christian understanding?
Yes, because if this is what the church has traditionally believed, then so should we. But as soon as you showed them, they really care about the scripture. If you can show them scripture, they're okay. And so once you showed them this and you show it thoroughly, they just ran with it. It was so exciting. And that's one reason why I used to have my Chinese pseudonym. Some people found it offensive. I understand that. But part of the reason is that all of this research came out of conversations with these house church believers who didn't have any voice. And I just thought one of the things that was a concern was like, I need to honor them with reflecting that these are their ideas. Actually, it's their lens, and the conversation with them when they helped me to see scripture with the honor shame lens that wow, that's there and that's there and that's there. And so once the Chinese felt like they could expand beyond tradition, legal categories, then it became natural to them.
Interesting. That's I found that as I've traveled the world a bit, like I'm kind of shocked at how American, or like how the theology is much more American than or Western. I shouldn't say American, but Western.
I've been in many sermons, listened to many preachers in China that preach in Chinese, because everything we did was in Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounded like a sermon I would hear in an Alabama Baptist church.
Wow.
I was just blown away at the lack of Chineseness of the theology, because we're not talking about the academic guild here. We're talking about on the ground pastors. And so that was what was so exciting, was when you help say, hey, you know how you see the world this way? Yeah. Now, what would happen if you remember that as you're reading this? And they would notice these things. And it became so exciting because their evangelism just took off. And they had language to describe, their experience and whatnot. It wasn't one of the things I'll say this, I'm sorry, is that one of the reasons why this matters, really a big deal, is because in China, it was felt that you had to either be Chinese or Christian. And I've had multiple people say, you know what, I feel like I can finally be a Chinese Christian. Because they didn't feel like they had to be a Western Christian, but then a Chinese in the rest of their life. So that's a huge deal.
So is it starting to change? Is there now more like theological works and things that are coming from Chinese leaders? Or are they still drinking from the Western type of theology?
Yeah. And I don't want to throw Western theology into the bus, because all cultures have their benefits and limitations, but it really comes down to money and training.
Okay.
But so like what gets published, what gets translated, right? Yeah. I mean, so yes, there is an increase, but when you're dealing with a persecuted church, there's only so much that you're going to see a lot of that. It's always going to be the funded, government church or the Western church that's going to be able to get resources in.
This episode is sponsored by Athletic Greens. Okay, so I've tried all kinds of different nutrition drinks off and on over the last 15 years, and the one that I found to be the most effective is Athletic Greens, which is now called AG1. Just so you know, I've been taking AG1 for about 9 months prior to them sponsoring this podcast. Okay, so I'm not just supporting some random product. I'm promoting AG1 because I've already been a huge fan of it. AG1 is like a nutrition bomb to the body. One scoop of AG1 just saturates your system with a wide variety of nutrients. It's packed with 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. It actually replaces a lot of other supplements that you won't need anymore, like taking a multivitamin every single day. And it contains various nutrients that supports your gut health. And I don't know if you know this, but your gut health is like so essential to the overall health of your body. I've experienced a noticeable difference in my energy, my alertness, and just like my overall well-being by taking AG1 at least once a day. Sometimes like when I'm traveling, I'll take it twice a day. And one scoop of AG1 a day, I mean, it's a price of it's less than like a cup of coffee a day. So well worth the money. If you're looking for a simpler and cost-effective supplement routine, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. So go to athleticgreens.com/TITR. That's athleticgreens.com/TITR. Check it out. Well, okay, let's talk about your pseudonym then, because I know that's I mean, most people aren't gonna. It was something that kind of flared up on social media fairly recently. So you have gone by Jackson Wu for up until, you said, like a month ago or something. And can you explain the reason why you took on that name?
Yeah, I needed a pseudonym because somebody asked me to publish an article, and so we need a pseudonym. But at the same time, because these thoughts were coming out from these conversations, it just felt like I was stealing to just have a name that didn't honor my Chinese brothers and sisters, especially the house church, who didn't have any kind of public voice. So my wife and I decided, okay, let's do, this is, like I said, a long time ago, where we decided, okay, let's do a Chinese name. So it's Jackson Wu. So it honors them. And I didn't think anything of it as a one-off article. And then I ended up publishing something else. And then my dissertation drew a lot of attention. And then all of a sudden now I had like a little bit of a paper trail. And so the name just kept going on for security reasons and basically to honor the Chinese culture as well, because to them in the mainland Chinese context, it's honoring to take a Chinese name. When mainland Chinese heard this, they said, "Oh, you love China so much, you have a Chinese name." And
so it's not, they don't see it as cultural appropriation.
Oh, that's a non-category to them. Absolutely not. They when I've talked to Chinese about this concept, it's utterly confusing to them. No, this is really a Western and more North American type conversation that's going on. So when I came back to the States, I was completely caught off guard by these dynamics, because I mean, mainland Chinese culture and Asian American cultures are not the same. And but sometimes you're expected to, they hold you by the rules of Asian American culture, when I was like, I've always been thinking mainland culture and how to honor them. So anyways, it was a big whiplash for me.
So wait, did you experience from Asian American culture, Asian Americans, that they felt like it was appropriation, but mainland China?
Not until the Twitter stuff happened.
Okay.
I mean, my biggest supporters have been mainland Chinese and Asian Americans. Wow. I've been invited to Asian American churches and talks. I was invited to be a part of the Asian American Theology Committee for ETS, Evangelical Theological Society. They knew I was white, but they felt like what I was writing was helpful and whatnot. So those have always been my biggest supporters. It wasn't until the Twitter storm last month that I really got any kind of significant pushback from Asian Americans.
I guess, well, since we're here, we do need to, maybe fill us in on the gist. I didn't have you on the talk. I want to talk about honor shame. It's something I've been wanting to do for many years now. But it's not completely unrelated, I think, because I just your whiplash experience, I think, is actually super interesting to me. Here you are living in China for a couple decades, coming back, and now facing this really kind of different cultural context where you're being accused of some things that, I don't know. It's just it was interesting to me. That's only where I can, bizarre maybe better term. So yeah, can you maybe explain what you're talking about?
There's there's a whole. I mean, it's a little bit confusing when you think about this solidarity among and collective identity that you share as a church in China. And then you come back to the States and there's such fragmentation and everybody's so angry. That was one of the biggest things that caught me off guard, was how angry just in general people have been in America. And you understand about loyalty to your group and being family in China. And then here, it was like, oh, the family is so fragmented. And so that was a big thing that kind of threw me off. There's a lot of silos, I was talking about America being an honor shame culture. We still have our honor shame groups, but we think we're individuals when really they're just our tribes and our silos and, whatever names we want to put to it. And the truth is that we can't get honor from all the groups. And the thing is that, Twitter tends to represent just a few subcultures. Yeah. That not necessarily the broader subculture. And so it's weird because it's like there's this value for being an individual, but yet you are still being judged by the collective. It's this weird tension that America is in right now. But it's been a real good personal.
Well, can you explain what happened just for people that are?
Yeah. So there are people who are upset that I had the pseudonym Jackson Wu because they were saying it was cultural appropriation, that I was being disrespectful or hurting Asian Americans because I had a Wu surname. At the same time, I had critiqued a book written by a Black woman. I'm not sure if she's African American or is African because she's originally from Ethiopia. I'm not sure if she's became an American. And so putting those two together caused a real big firestorm to where it came across as me pretending to be an Asian man to critique a Black woman's book as if I was trying to get one over. And it was just basically a perfect storm. It was just none of that was my intent. And so I had to give up the pseudonym. So I just go by Brad now. And now my books have been switched to Brad Vaughn and not Jackson Wu.
Why did you give it up? Do you think it's wise to give it up, or did you just didn't want to put up with the storm anymore, or do you think there was like?
Well, for one thing, it was forced on me because some believers or some people online put my face and my name together, which for me was frankly really heartbreaking because people didn't realize the security concerns that could be linked to my ongoing work. Because I mean, that's a threat to the Chinese church because people don't know how much I'm intertied. And so that was just kind of forced on me at that point. And so I didn't, in that sense, I didn't have a choice. But on the other hand, I'm like, I'd also don't want it to be a distraction to the message that I'm trying to get out in the future. So if that's what I need to do, then that's what I need to do. I want to be loving, and I'm trying to contextualize.
Yeah. In both directions coming back.
Yeah. It's been really hard on me personally, not me personally in the sense of like, I feel offended. It's I feel hurt at how much misunderstanding there is about the Chinese church and missions and the persecution there, and not having concern for the possible danger that people could be in because people don't know the links that I have or don't have. So there's that. But it's also, it's been really helpful for me as just personally because you remember how fragile a public platform is. And I've had to ask myself, if I ever lose my platform publicly and they take away all my books, am I okay with who I am and how I'm living?
Yeah.
So that's been a really constructive thing that the Lord has done in my heart through this.
So they put your name and your picture on, they publicized that?
Yeah.
And did they realize that that's hindering the work among this persecuted church? I mean, that's, you would think that that's like, did the Chinese government do that? You're like, no, was it a Christian that did that?
The Christians were recycling, cycling and spreading it. I mean, it got pretty nasty. People don't even get that as nasty as it got online as it did like in the Chinese church. Even people disagree, they wouldn't be like that. But I mean, it's one thing to hate me, but to do that and take out the Chinese church on get them in trouble, possibly, that's what was heartbreaking.
Were your Chinese brothers and sisters, they didn't know about all this? And were they confused? Like, why are our brothers and sisters in America doing this to us?
I had Chinese reach out to me and basically express anger that what is going on? This is ridiculous, and so just basically being an encouragement. They just don't get American culture in these dynamics.
Yeah. Does it make you want to go back to China?
We never wanted to leave.
Yeah.
We left because of security concerns.
Okay.
We were hoping to eventually go back, but that can't happen.
Okay.
Now with this, because it's just too public now. Now my name's Brad on all the books. I can't go into a lot. Now I can't. Yeah. And that's saddening as well, because it also means other security sensitive countries that now I could be a threat to somebody, all because they made that link.
So it's a double whammy. It not only is added or put the Chinese church under a threat, but now it's prevented you from doing any ongoing or the kind of ongoing work you. Wow. Golly.
Yeah. And so that's with the grieving. So it's been like a death, because you're kind of forever separated from them in a certain sense,
Has anybody reached out? I mean, the people that maybe were part of stirring all this up, whatever, have they reached out and said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize that this is going to happen"? Have anybody apologized or anything? Or
No, not at all. And in fact, a lot of them have doubled down and said, and basically like, you're making excuses, and they'll try to find contradictions when I'm saying. And basically, I stopped trying to explain things online because there's nuance that you have to explain on that, and then there's only so many words you can say. And I'm like, you know what? I can't explain to everybody to where they like it. I'm just going to take the actions I need to and then move on.
Yeah.
I was called everything. At one point, I collected the insults thrown at me as I was a misogynist, racist, dehumanizing yellowface who was attacking and trying to silence a Black woman's worth. I strung together a whole things that were said of me. And so it's sad to me that the American church are so much of that, it's all in public. And in Chinese church, you just don't get that. It's dealt with more relationally.
So you being gone for almost 2 decades, coming back, have you seen a shift in American culture? So when you went over there, the internet was barely taken off. There was no social media, and now you come back where that's kind of all-consuming aspect of our culture.
Yeah,
Have you
gay
seen a
marriage wasn't even a
radical?
thing. Gay marriage wasn't even a thing then.
Huh,
And
wow,
so
yeah.
a lot of these dynamics and kind of social cues in terms of how you have conversation and whatnot have just so completely changed. There's only so much that you can glean this from the internet, right? A lot of the word policing. And so like I'll say something like, oh, you can't say this. I'm like, oh, I didn't know I couldn't say that,
Oh,
right?
wow, yeah.
It's just, you don't know what things convey,
Huh,
because people don't understand that living a long time across cultures changes who you are. I mean, we are cross-cultural beings. If you think about if you grew up in rural Arkansas and then obviously you moved to New York City, you're going to be a hybrid, right? Of cultures. It works the same thing for people like myself. And so, I mean, it is what it is.
what do you
But,
do? Yeah, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, but I'm growing from it and I'm learning from it. And I'm hoping to love people through this.
Yeah. How's your wife done through it?
It's been hard on her,
Yeah.
particularly because, to appeal to one of your former guests, Josh Butler, who released the Beautiful Union, he's one of the pastors at our church, and he had a firestorm that was going on. It was about 2 weeks in. It was a height of it, and then all of a sudden, my stuff broke out,
Oh, wow.
and so you had both of those things going on because she's on staff at the church.
Your wife is?
Yeah, she's on staff at the church.
Okay.
And so you had that going on. They had my stuff going on. And then our kids, for them, it was really sad because they're also tied to me. And will their ability to ever minister in China be affected? You just don't know.
What do you what do you do for work now? What's your ministry or?
I am the publishing marketing director for William Carey Publishing.
Okay.
I came back to when I came back to the States, I worked with a mission organization, but COVID hurt the funding. I was unemployed for 9 months, and so I don't get to do a lot of the theologian missiology type stuff that I've done in the past at this point. But I'm hoping,
Yeah.
that I get to do more of that. But that's what I'm doing now,
Okay.
and so it's an adjacent field.
So missions is pretty much for the foreseeable future, not not in the plan. I mean, yeah.
No, it's not. So, I mean, I'll use my training and my skill sets, hopefully, to equip missions and equip the American church. Because, like I said, I'm seeing so many ways that shame is affecting the American church, unhealthy ways that people deal with shame in the West, and so I hope to minister here as well.
Yeah. What are some big picture things that you see as like major like blind spots in?
Well, like for example, one way that people try to avoid shame is by removing responsibility, casting blame on genetics or the environment or political systems or whatever else, and that's one thing.
Blame shifting.
A lot of blame shifting, but the problem with that is that it perpetuates the lie that our worth still depends on minimizing our flaws and failures. Where you're like, you know what? Yeah, you have this genetic issue or this environment or whatever the systemic issue, but you know what? Sinful, flawed, weak people still have worth. Another thing is identity. People idolize identity, so they absolutize it as if they centralize it. And so if you attack any aspect of identity, then you get a whole virtual holy war, right?
Yeah.
People changing identities left and right, just however they want. And so because I was shamed here, so I take on this identity, and so, I mean, I'm speaking really, really big picture.
Sure.
And of course, the one that's most popular these days is just being shameless. You can't shame me. And you're like, okay, that's actually not a good thing. Because to be shameless is to be a dangerous person, to not care about what other people, and so.
Shame can be a healthy deterrent. Is that, or how would you?
Oh, it's absolutely a healthy thing. I mean, Paul used shame, but there's healthy ways and non-healthy ways of using shame. For example, Paul, he spoken about shameful actions, not shameful people. And because it's about, do you want to be this kind of person? Yeah, I do. Okay. So that's a healthy use of shame, not a you suck, you're terrible, you're awful. That's a bad use of shame,
Yeah.
But the only way you can really deal with shame, though, well, is to expose it, to talk about it, to embrace weakness and still affirm people's worth,
Okay. There was a book I got sent as an academic book. I think it was a dissertation called Defending Shame. Have you come across this?
Yeah, Tully Lau. It's an
Yeah.
excellent book. Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
That's a bold title as in the culture today, post Brene Brown, where shame is just such a, to have shame is like the worst thing, I was like, oh wow, this is going to be it. And the fact that I think is he, I mean, Asian American on some.
Yeah, he is. I think he's Malaysian Chinese, but he's American. And excellent book. It is academic, but a really solid treatment showing how Paul constructively uses shame to help construct and edify the church.
Yeah.
And so we're missing out on a whole big resource in scripture, honor and shame. That's a big deal everywhere. And so I'm so glad to see more and more books on this topic coming out.
Yeah. I remember I was in Nepal several years ago and talking to we have a bunch of pastor friends over there and stuff. I'm talking to one pastor and we're talking about like sex outside of marriage and stuff, and they have a lot of the same, they're wrestling with a lot of the same stuff the American church is, and I remember asking him like, so what would you do if you have a member that's is caught in a sexually immoral relationship? And without hesitation he says, well, we would shame him. Like we would publicly shame him, and hopefully that would bring him back to repentance, without even, I was like almost like poking my coffee. I was like, whoa, you publicly shame him? But
it's not in the way it is here, because here in individualism, to shame somebody is to utterly isolate them without hope, because you don't have this group ties. But if you're really tied to somebody, like a good buddy, good brothers, good, close, and someone shames you, then, but they fundamentally love you, they're for you, you receive it different. And this is one reason why you can't just use these shame tactics in the church without having a really healthy sense of we are family, we are a people together, because honor and shame are inherently collective, group identity oriented. And so that's why they can say that, because you can still shame somebody and yet they understand that you're still part of the group. Whereas the way it's used in individualistic cultures, it's seen as like utter casting out, like without any hope, because there's not these strong ties.
And the communal, and I think what he was getting at was, this as part of this body, and it's a Hindu country, the church is small, so I mean it's very stark difference between being a Christian and not being a Christian. So when this person commits this sin, it brings shame on the community, which also brings shame on the God they're trying to represent. So I almost heard him say, he didn't quite word it like this, but if I am hearing him right, he's kind of like, we would publicly expose the shame that he has brought on us so that we can relieve that shame. Like, it wasn't this dehumanizing Twitter shame or something, I mean,
there's a protection that's meant to happen, protecting of the community as well, right? So it's not just we got to take them down and destroy them. It's not like cancel culture is today. I mean, that's like the unhealthy form of shame in America. There's no relationship. They're at a distance. There's no context, but inside that relationship, it can be a really, really helpful thing, because you're basically saying, hey, do you want to be this kind of person? Yeah, you're not. You know what? You're right. And it brings them back in.
Brad, cancel culture doesn't actually exist. It's made up.
Tell me and Josh about it. But you know what? As weird as it sounds, the Lord was very encouraging to me, because I just kept saying, what? They can't cancel me because Jesus doesn't cancel me. And so it was really a sweet time of drawing near to the Lord, trying to be teachable, realizing that we won't always agree, but just trying to go, in the end, the Lord is better than his people are acting.
Interesting. And I do think that you mentioned it kind of in passing, just kind of the disconnect between kind of these different social worlds we live in, our embodied neighborhood, city, church, where our bodies actually are, then you have various online spaces, and even those can be very different. I mean, Twitter is very different from like Instagram and Facebook. Facebook and Twitter are kind of similar in some ways, but still kind of different. But then if you look at like how representative these kind of worlds are, and you enter into this, say you enter into like Twitter, and you're like, oh my gosh, is this representative? Then there's a study that was done that said, 7% of people are responsible for 97% of all tweets. So we're dealing with this is it was a Gallup poll that I think 25% of Americans have a Twitter account. Most of them aren't really using it much. I might once a month, maybe. A lot of them are just kind of sitting there. But there's a small percentage of that. I think it's a quarter of the 25%, whatever. So about 7% that are responsible for 97% of all the tweets. So you can think that this is like representative, but it really is this cloistered kind of like, group of people. Then you go to Facebook, and it's like all people like, our age and older typically ranting and raving, and then Instagram is like people, I wish I had that life, or it's just, and then all of that put together is like all of that's kind of just part of our humanity is kind of expressed in these spheres, and it's just not,
because identity is far more complex than Americans are making it out to be. Americans tend to be like, this sphere of my life is my identity, where the truth is identity is how we're the same as some people and how we're different than other people. My identity is a compilation of various relationships. Honor shame cultures grasp this, but what I think a lot of vitriol that you see online comes from people take one sliver of their identity, absolutize it, and then if it's made sacred, now it's a holy war. It has to be, because you're challenging my sacred identity, and because we've lost all kinds of nuance about how relationships work in collective identity. Because when I talk about honor shame, I'm talking about collective identity. And collective identity is a much more complex thing than Americans grasp, because we have so little practice at thinking about it.
That's interesting. Wow.
But it's not hard to grasp. Sports culture, the military, the American South, these are all honor shame cultures.
Interesting. Yeah, sports culture for sure. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, I mean, look at just watch an SEC game, and a football game, or March Madness, right? I mean, in what people say, we won the championship, and you're like, you weren't out there, or it's like they really stunk last night, because we intuitively grasp this contagious shame honor thing.
I often meet my buddy, because I'm a huge Dodger fan, baseball fan in general, and I catch myself saying we won last night too. Oh my word. And I'm very aware of kind of the we, like there's a whole nother conversation, like I rarely, if ever, use a plural pronoun to refer to my American identity. Like, so I don't, I'm trying to get in the habit of using it as my global Christian identity. So I would never say like our troops, like, because the global church doesn't have a military, I would never say, so I try, but then it's funny when when it comes to baseball, I just naturally, we won. I'm like, oh crud, like I'm doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that when you start grasping how these things affect us normally, this collective identity, honor, shame, you not only realize stuff like that, but you reclaim the church. Because if from individualistic perspective, that individualistic lens wipes out the need for the church. What's the point? Me and Jesus were cool. The church is just a bonus, right? But conversion becomes not just I was in this bad category, now I'm with Jesus, but it's a conversion from one group to another. I was fundamentally saw myself as a part of some identity in the world, but now I'm fundamentally aligned with Christ. I'm part of this group, the people of God, the church, right? And
we don't have that in America. I mean, right? That's just, you get saved and then you go to a church, and I mean, it's fairly rare. I think, I mean, it is what it is, but I mean, I think it's fairly rare to have that conversion to this, like I get it a lot, like in I do a lot of work with faith and sexuality, and I'm always people are like, how do we reach the LGBTQ community, the community that's not inside the church? And I'm like, well, I'm almost a little worried about that. Like, that's a really strong multi-layered community that has a history of mistreatment and abuse, and especially the church hurt, shame, and all that stuff. If an individual from that tight community actually got saved, what's the new community?
Mm.
Are they going to experience the same kind of community, especially if they're still, they're still attracted to the same sex, or still, have a sexuality that's very different than many people in the church? And I'm like, what do we give?
Questions like this are one of the very first questions that you'll hear from Chinese or Arabs or people from people from different collectivist cultures, is they want to know, what community will I be going to?
Yes.
Like, what does this mean for my belonging to this community? And literally first things they're thinking of. And I heard a Muslim woman say, like, she was like reluctant to become a believer because she didn't see any kind of church around. She's like, okay, you're asking me to leave my community for what? So they saw this as a conversion from one community to another. It doesn't mean that you give up being female or Black or a Dodger fan or whatever else. Yeah. It just means that those are not absolutized, because Jesus is absolute. The people of God, those who are loyal to him, become your fundamental collective identity.
And so not just, because I think most Christians in the West would say, yeah, I get converted to Christ and now Christ is on the throne of my life, but it still is very individualistic. The vertical kind of one-on-one identity might be reoriented, maybe, but the communal,
that's the most individualistic thing you possibly say. Yeah, I don't make Jesus the Lord of my life. Right. Jesus is Lord, whether or not I recognize it or not.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you see how even our language betrays this whole, like, you don't need the church when we're talking like that, right? And if we don't have the church, so many other things get messed up. Like, how do you become disciples outside of the community of faith? You can't.
Yeah. I would imagine the whole idea that you can be kind of a Christian and not be in community with other believers would just be so foreign in the Chinese. That wouldn't make sense.
No, absolutely not. It's just nonsensical. It's like a contradiction.
Yeah.
Because I mean, they're focused on who are we, not just, have I done something, right or wrong? We tend to think, what's the most minimal thing? Which is think about that. A guilt culture is all about transgression. Have I transgressed or not transgressed, right? And we kind of take that same mentality with faith. What's that boundary line where I've done just enough or not done enough, right, to be in, right? Whereas our non-Western majority world friends are thinking about more, who are we? That's a whole different orientation.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Brad, it's taking you over an hour. This is great getting to know you. Do you still, you go by Brad now, not
yeah.
Is that hard to get used to now for 20 years being Jackson?
It has been weird. It has been weird. And other people have told me it's weirder who talk to me, because I just went by Jackson, people. And so, it has been an adjustment. And we're seeing my name on my books as Brad Vaughn now is,
it's odd.
Yeah. It feels like I'm exposed because you've lived 20 years trying to keep everything secret.
Wow, that's wild. Well, thank you, man. And love your rawness and your realness. And thanks for the work you're doing. And it was great getting to know you.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate that. And if anybody wants to, look me up online to stay up on this stuff, my website is savinggodsface.com.
Okay.
Savinggodsface.com. And so they can follow up on some of these things if they want.
Awesome. Cool, man. Thank you. Appreciate it.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.